Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has almost certainly set a precedent for supplementary gameplay in the series, with its rich sprawl of sidequests and minigames that pocket the reimagined world. Whether that's the moderately infuriating Cactuar Crush, the oddly Assassin's Creed-esque Remwave Towers that unlock map locations, or the well-renowned G-Bike Challenge at the Gold Saucer, Rebirth has sought to add additional challenge, enjoyment and reward to the game experience with all of this additional stuff that you can do. And chief among these, I think, at least for me, was the card game Queen's Blood, which, like other game challenges in Rebirth, progressively opens up and unlocks as the story progresses and is served by its own unique little ecosystem and narrative arc. And I really like to break that down here, as well as comparing it with other popular card games in Final Fantasy. It's worth noting that I will be providing minor details about both Queen's Blood and Triple Triad from Final Fantasy VIII, but I won't be providing any spoilers or story discussions for these minigames or the main stories, so it is a safe listen if you're happy to just hear about the mechanics and the functions of these respective games and how they stack up against one another. Now, touching first on Queen's Blood, this was doubly interesting to me as a minigame when I first discovered it, because like many things in Rebirth, it does nod back to and cannibalise some legacy elements and gameplay features from earlier in the series, with card games periodically cropping up to a greater or lesser degree in a few Final Fantasy games. And the most famous example of that being, as I've just mentioned, Final Fantasy VIII's Triple Triad. And this is interesting to me because while Triple Triad is hugely popular for a number of different reasons, and I think that Queen's Blood is rightly the closest contender to that to date, if we really look at them and break down their form and function, how they contribute or not to their respective game experiences as a whole, and how they work as side quests and minigames, they're actually really quite different game experiences. And I think it's worth taking a moment looking at how they contribute to and synergize with the overall games that they inhabit. Now, jumping right in and looking first at the anatomy of these respective games. On paper, they are both quite similar. So they are both 1v1 games that are played out on a gridded board. They both involve a player having a hand of cards, and the aim of each game is to have numerical supremacy over your opponent. So in the case of Triple Triad, that is successfully flipping more of the opponent's cards to your colour on the game board than what they have. And in Queen's Blood, by slightly more complex means, it involves racking up a higher score on your board counter than your opponent. So on paper, quite a similar premise, but within both of these, there is slightly more nuance to the means of play. And in the case of Triple Triad, each side of a playing card has a number, and at its most basic level, if you play a card beside an opponent's card that has a lower number, you flip that card and it becomes yours on the 3x3 game board. However, as you progress through the game, complexity is added to this, since each region of the world has its own distinct rule sets that are adopted or discarded as you go. So things such as sudden death, random card hands, plus and same rules, which add infuriating combos that can wipe out the entire game board for you, and so on. So it is something of a dark art to try and navigate that, because depending on who and when you play Triple Triad, different rules are applied. And I know it is possible to manage this and sort of game the game, but I've never personally done it. And so by the time I get to the stages where I'm trying to win kind of important character cards, it's really hard to do. So for example, on the Luna base, where you're trying to win the Laguna card from alone, there's always like obscene rules there, like sudden death and random and whatever. So it becomes really quite a complex and challenging game. Beyond these basic rules, and sort of similar to where they went with Final Fantasy VII's Queen's Blood, you have elementals. So some cards will have an element applied, such as wind or fire or water appended to them. So for example, the Ifrit card is a fire card, and with the elemental rule in play, you also have elemental symbols on the board grid. So for example, playing Ifrit on a grid section that has the fire symbol, his card goes up by a point. But if you play Ifrit on an opposing element, then the point goes down. So you have that sort of plus minus thing applied to it there. So that's a really top level view of Triple Triad. Turning instead now to Queen's Blood, we have a fundamentally more complex game, both in terms of card attributes and how to play on the grid itself. So here we are operating on a 5x3 grid instead of a 3x3 grid, where the aim is to score the highest number on a given horizontal row, or lanes as they are called in the game. And these must total the highest score overall to win. So for example, on the 3 rows, if you score 5 on the top row and your opponent scores 2 on the top row, then you win the row and you get 5 points. If you score 2 on the middle row and your opponent scores 3, then you lose that row and your opponent has 3 points. And then again, if you score 5 on the lowest row and your opponent scores 3, then you win the row and you win the game because you have accumulated 10 points in total while your opponent has 3 points in total. In addition to this, rather than cards being placed anywhere you want, like on Triple Triad's noughts and crosses style layout, players must work left to right across the Queen's Blood board, activating new grid tiles with their cards for subsequent cards to be placed on them. And the complexity here comes from the fact that your cards have both a numerical number, which is what contributes to that overall score for the lane, but they also have a level between 1 and 3 which dictates where and when they can be placed on the board. And on top of that, they have unique activation patterns too. So some cards can activate panels to their right or to the bottom or to the top of them, and that will dictate what tiles are activated and thus can be used to place other cards. And in some cases, they can also positively or negatively impact other areas of the grid as well, and that can help and hinder both player and enemies. Finally, there are card abilities, which are available on some cards, and this can range from gaining numbers every time another card is affected by something. So a card that has a base number of 4 can end up having something like 25 by the end of the game. It can include generating new cards for you. So for example, if you play the Sid Highwind card, it generates the Tiny Bronco card, which you can then play. And some cards can likewise level up or level down or outright destroy other cards on the game board, making it a much more strategic game than its predecessor in Triple Triad, which in a way, you would hope and expect from a minigame that's coming 25 years later. But I really liked this because it gets much more advanced, and you will find yourself kind of sitting there for several minutes at a time, assessing the game board, assessing what hand you have and how you might gain some sort of advantage. So I really enjoyed that, and I thought Queen's Blood, though there was a learning curve, I thought it was fantastic. So that's a top level look at both minigames. Now moving on to their function and attributes in relation to their respective games, and starting first with Triple Triad, it's interesting to consider this because this is where we start getting into risk and reward and how the games contribute to and loop back into the main game mechanics and aspects of the game world. So in the case of Triple Triad, you have the rewards of leveled cards that you can acquire as you go, and where basic cards are your basic monsters from the game, so bite bugs or gizzards or whatever, quite low ranking cards, you can work your way up by defeating players and acquire more important cards, such as GF cards like Ifrit and Shiva, and ultimately character cards like Squall, Cypher, and so on. And the risk and reward element of that is that the loser of any given card game loses one or more of their card deck to their opponents. So it becomes actually quite a high stakes and thoroughly annoying game in some cases, where if you lose a game, they almost always will take your nice character cards, which can take a long time to try and win back, which is enjoyable for some and frustrating for others. It depends what you value in play. In terms of contribution to the main game, Final Fantasy VIII includes a unique card mod ability, which is fantastic, and this basically refines cards from your deck into rare items, and the better the card, the rarer or more useful the item is going to be. And so a lot of the character cards, for example, can refine into items that are needed for ultimate weapons and stuff like that. And a personal favourite of mine is refining the Laguna card into 100 heroes, because then you can basically be invincible for difficult boss fights. And so there's a really tangible utility and payoff for the Triple Triad game, and an incentive to sort of seek out and acquire all of these cards beyond doing it for the sake of it. And actually, I did an episode a while back, a top 5 of Final Fantasy minigames, and I will link to that, because I sort of discuss how the more successful minigames tend to loop back in and have tangible benefits or rewards for the player in the core mechanics of the game, and Triple Triad is a great example of that. Coming to Queen's Blood, we broadly speaking have the opposite of this Triple Triad approach, where the risk and reward is generally limited, and aside from losing a few gil to some card players in Junon, there isn't much by way of forfeiting cards or losing anything really. And so as you are playing to win new cards or progress the side quests, the risk involved is comparatively limited compared to Triple Triad. In addition to that, the function and benefit of the cards themselves don't have any intrinsic value beyond the ecosystem of the Queen's Blood minigame. So unlike the card refining of Final Fantasy VIII, which can really aid with item acquisition and weapon synthing and combat and stuff like that, Queen's Blood is very much a self-contained feature for the most part. You can win gold saucer points, the gold saucer and little bits like that, but not too much beyond that, which is interesting because one of the reasons that Final Fantasy IX's ill-fated Tetra card game fell off so badly is in part because there was no real purpose or reward to that minigame beyond the game itself, that looped back into Final Fantasy IX proper. And I think Queen's Blood, really worked well in how it was built to sort of avoid that fate. So, despite these differences to Triple Triad in terms of reward systems, Queen's Blood succeeds in contributing to Rebirth in other ways beyond the simple enjoyment of playing it, and it is very enjoyable. And perhaps the main one of these is the expansion of the lore and the world building in Final Fantasy VII. And while, yes, Final Fantasy VIII Triple Triad sort of has narrative, because there's a side quest where you have to seek out and defeat the mysterious card club of Balamb Garden, Rebirth's Queen's Blood really doubles down on narrative by having an entire world and story of card players build up around this minigame. And this side quest comes with its own cutscenes, its own arc, and its own reveals, revolving around the players of the game. So, as such, the unfolding story and the lore is the reward unto itself of playing Queen's Blood, on top of winning the cards themselves. And so I think this provides purpose, though not necessarily utilitarian purpose, to pursuing Queen's Blood in FF7 Rebirth. So that's a top-level comparison of the two mini-games, and I think it's been really interesting to sort of play them both, assess their particular pros and cons, and I was amazed actually at how strong I took away the Queen's Blood experience from playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, such that I enjoyed it. And really, it does ultimately come down to the individual player for how they sort of assess and appreciate these respective minigames. Because, for example, I know some players who don't necessarily like minigames, but they would go through the process of Triple Triad because they want to get these items from refining the good cards. And so they would sort of labour through it just so they could sort of get the ultimate weapons items and stuff like that. So they may not care for Queen's Blood if that's their sort of approach to Final Fantasy games, because it doesn't have that utility. But on the other hand, you have some players who won't really care about refining cards at all and are much more driven by the experience, the story, and the world building. So with that mindset, Queen's Blood would really suit them down to the ground. As for me, I've long professed to being a Final Fantasy VIII fanboy. I absolutely love the game. I love every aspect of the game, including Triple Triad. But it would be disingenuous for me to say that I preferred the actual playing of Triple Triad more than I do Queen's Blood, because I think the strategy, the mechanics, and the gameplay of the latter is really, really good. So in an ideal world for me, I would have a bit of both worlds. And if Queen's Blood had a bit more of a reward system and a risk and reward system appended to it that would pay off in the core game, whether that's winning rare weapons or items or whatever, like in Final Fantasy VIII, I think that would be close to perfect for a Final Fantasy card game for me. So I do think that they come away having their own respective pros and cons. So there we have it, a top-level breakdown of two hugely popular Final Fantasy card games, and really wanted it to be the first thing I discuss about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, because it was such a novel experience to go through Queen's Blood. And I would love to know which of these two games you preferred.